And there we go. So, as I sent out on my message to the listserv, the world can be falling apart around us, but we're still going to read Torah this Shabbos. So, there's certain things are in disarray, but in other things, there is a set routine that is happening. So, and that's what the Jewish calendar is, and that's what it helps us do. Kind of make sure that we stay grounded no matter what happens, and the Jewish tradition provides us with support as well. We have a sense of community, and it's always interesting to me that whatever event happens in the world, there's always something in this week's Torah portion that comments about it, or the week's Torah portion that would comment about it. So we'll get there with this morning's Torah portion as VaYera, this week's portion, which is page 99 in the Eitz Chaim. 99 in Eitz Chaim, or chapter 18 of Genesis, whatever edition of the Chumash you're looking at. So good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to all the local people. Welcome to Pennsylvania and to Florida here that are on with us. So okay, so the prayer for Torah study, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I alluded to that the Torah portion has something to say about what's going on in America today, and we'll get there soon. What I want to look at is the very beginning of the portion. And I've taken notes on the parsha and a few things I want to look at. So we'll see if we can get to them all. So the portion begins. Well, first, before I even read the beginning of the portion, we have to remember, and we can look at it if you want on page 93, how last week's portion ended. And it's hard in a chumash that has a haftarah in between to really understand that even though this is chapter 18, verse 1, chapter 17, verse 27 came right before it. And you don't see that on the page. You have to go back 6 pages to see what the verse is right before chapter 18, verse 1. So we can't, the Chumash makes it seem like every portion exists in its own silo, but we can't understand it that way. The Torah is, and especially if we had a Torah scroll in front of us, we would see that it's one long story. And in fact, the way some Torah scrolls are written, every column in certain Torah scrolls, every column except for the very first one, because the first letter is the letter Bet and the word is Breshit. Every other column begins with the letter Vav, and that's called a Vav Torah. And the letter Vav, we know, those of us who know Hebrew well enough know that a Vav in front of a word means and. So if every column in the Torah begins with the letter Vav, from Breshit all the way to the end, then by having a letter Vav at the beginning of a column, it emphasizes how the entire Torah is one long story, and it's all connected. Every verse is connected with every other verse. So, which we don't necessarily see when we are reading Torah from a Chumash, that is, and not just an edition of a Bible where you don't have a haftarah in between, but a Chumash which has a haftarah in between. It's hard to remember, oh yeah, that's what we just read in the sentence before. So the end of last week's portion was from verse 24 on page 93 chapter 17, verse 24, Abraham was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Thus, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised on that very day, and all his household, his homeborn slaves, and those that had been bought from outsiders were circumcised with him. So that's how the portion Lech Lecha ends. Abraham, Ishmael, who's his only son at this point. Remember that Sarah's maid Hagar was given to Abraham to marry and to have a child through her, since Sarah was barren. So Ishmael is officially Abraham's son. And so everybody is circumcised. Now we begin our portion on page 99. And again, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt and ask, or you can go into chat on the bottom of your screen. Just press the word chat and you can just type a message or a question there, whichever way you're comfortable with. So our portion begins knowing that Abraham and Ishmael and everybody else in their house, or all males in their household, have just been circumcised. VaYera elav Adonai be'elonei Mamre v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel kechom hayom. So who's the to him? The Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Well, we only know who him is because we just read the last verses of the previous chapter where we're talking about Abraham. So without making that connection, we don't know who the him is. So now we know God appeared to Abraham by the terebinths of Mamre. It's a kind of tree. And Mamre, as the above the line commentary points out, is near the city of Hebron. So if you can picture in your mind's eye the map of Israel, Jerusalem, just south of Jerusalem is Bethlehem, and south of Bethlehem is Hebron. Okay, so they're all on a ridge in the Judean mountains. Okay, so that's he was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Vayisa enav vayar, looking up or raising up his eyes, or he raised up his eyes and saw. Vehine shlosha anashim, he saw three men, nitzavim alav, standing before him, or standing near him. As vayaratz likratam, he ran to meet them. He ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. Vayaratz likratam petach ha'ohel, right? He ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. Vayishtachu artza, and bowing to the ground. Now, vayishtachu artza. So is that he bowed down before them, or did they bow down? So I believe vayishtachu would be he bowed down before vayishtachu artza. He bowed down to the ground. Okay, so God appears and three men appear. So there are questions that the commentary raises, and instead of me asking the questions, let's look at the commentary below the line in Eitz Chaim to see what the issues are in these first couple of sentences. Even as the opening notes, excuse me, of a symphony often sound a theme that will be developed in various ways throughout the piece, the opening word of this fourth parsha of Genesis proclaims the theme VaYera. The Lord appeared or was seen. So it's the root to see. Seeing happens a lot in this portion. One incident after another involves people seeing or not seeing God. Hagar's eyes are opened to see the miraculous well God has provided for her in chapter 21, which happens later in the portion. Abraham sees God atop Mount Moriah, chapter 22, the end of the portion, while the servants who were traveling with him do not. One of the gifts with which spiritually sensitive people are blessed is the ability to see the presence of God in their daily experiences. Others sharing the same experiences are blind to the divine presence. So this is, before we even get into the details of the portion itself, that what our commentary is suggesting, good morning, Diane, we're just began the portion VaYera, chapter 18, verse 1 and 2. It's page 99 in the Eitz Chaim. Before the portion even begins, the commentary provides an interpretation of what seeing means. So seeing then, according to this commentary, is not literally seeing, like I see all of you on my screen. It's not that kind of, because that's objective. And on your screen, you see the same people on the screen as I do. They may be in a different order, but we're all on each other's screen and we all see. So what the commentary is suggesting is that it's not that kind of seeing that is being alluded to here. It is rather a perception. That, in other words, it's like how you have a certain set of facts before you, or a certain set of data, and depending upon how you interpret the data, one could see the facts pointing in one direction, and somebody else using the same data could see the facts pointing in a different direction. So I'm not just talking about the election, I'm talking about anything. So you could say it about climate change. For some scientists, it's obvious. Everybody sees that the ocean is rising and that it's hotter longer in certain parts of the world than it used to be. Whereas other scientists who are just as notable, just as reliable, would view those facts differently, that it could just be a blip in a long understanding and seeing ocean levels and temperatures over the centuries. I'm not arguing about climate change. I'm just giving an example of what seeing means. So the seeing here that the commentary is suggesting is not an obvious, you see the books on the shelf behind me. And the funny thing is, I have this behind me sometimes as a virtual background. So this is real. I'm pulling a book off the shelf. You see me pull the book off the shelf, so you know that this is a real background. If this were a virtual background, I'd be reaching there and then my hand would be fuzzy, right? So you could see the books behind me with the virtual background, but we're seeing really the books behind me because I'm pulling a book off the shelf, right? So you get my point. So seeing then, for the commentary, seeing here is believing. So there's faith involved in the seeing that is happening, okay? So God appeared. So the appearing, again, VaYera elav Adonai. God appeared to him, or God made himself be seen. We could be that literal with it. God was seen by Abraham. So did everybody else who's around Abraham see, like from the verses before, Ishmael's there, the other male members of the household, are they seeing God before Abraham? That's unclear. All that's important to us is that Abraham is able to see God before him. Okay, so just want to make sure that we understand that the word seeing is nuanced. Okay, so now the commentary goes on. And again, if anybody has a question or a comment, just unmute yourself and just interrupt. By visiting Abraham, so Eitz Chaim below the line is continuing. By visiting Abraham to distract him from the pain of recovering from his circumcision, God provides us with an example of the mitzvah of visiting the sick, known in Hebrew as Bikur Cholim. Okay, so now that's why we had to read the beginning of this parsha in context with the verses that came at the end of last week's portion. So if Abraham had just circumcised himself at age 99, imagine even if he had gone in for an outpatient procedure to have the circumcision, which at age 99 would not be an outpatient procedure, you'd be in the hospital for a couple of days. Imagine doing that to yourself. That's a painful procedure that takes a lot of time to recover. So he's sitting in front of the tent, recovering based on context, recovering. God's visiting Abraham. So the rabbis in the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud Sota, that's what that reference is in the parentheses, page 14a, suggests that we learn the mitzvah of visiting the sick from none other than God performing the mitzvah for Abraham. And so the idea is, as the commentary continues, visiting the sick may not physically alter the course of an illness, right? So just by visiting doesn't mean the person's going to get better, but the knowledge that people care may ease the suffering and discomfort of one who is ill or recuperating and dispel any fears that the suffering is deserved because he or she is a bad person. All right, so this gets into the whole understand the psychology and the benefit of visiting the sick. So visiting the sick used to happen on Shabbat after shul. So the Shulchan Aruch has a section about visiting the sick, when it should be done, when is the best time to perform this mitzvah of visiting the sick. And it's usually done Shabbat morning after davening is over, because everybody in shul would see who's not there, right? This is from a time when everybody went to shul. So nobody would consider skipping shul on Shabbat. So in a time when everybody went to shul, if somebody was missing, something's the matter. So that's the time to go then visit to make sure everything's okay. So Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, can happen anytime. Certainly it's part of my responsibilities as your rabbi to, now with the COVID, at least to call and perhaps to Zoom, but it's not necessarily safe to go to the hospital to visit in person, or to go to a nursing or a rehab facility to do that. But that's part of my responsibility to do that. But it's not just me who does that. Good morning, Manny. Good to see you. We're just looking at the portion VaYera, and if you have the Eitz Chaim, we're on page 99. It's chapter 18 in the Chumash. So it's not just my responsibility as your rabbi to visit the sick who are members of Sharei Tefillah, but it's everybody's responsibility to really reach out. So we have a Chesed committee that reaches out to people in the congregation too. And so to help all of us participate in that mitzvah and to fulfill the mitzvah of visiting the sick. And as the commentary points out, we know that there are tremendous psychological benefits that the sick person receives, knowing that somebody has reached out just by a phone call or actually making the effort to come visit in person. People emotionally feel better, and some medical research has been done to point out that it even helps in the recuperation. That people who know that people who have sick people who have people visiting them, or even sick people who know that people are praying for them, have that sense of emotional uplift received from that knowledge has long-term benefit. So there are, recuperating from a broken leg is going to happen, whether people are going to visit or not. But the attitude that one receives when people, sign their name on the cast, and the cast is then filled up with lots of signatures, the person with the broken leg is going to feel a lot better, and that the pain of the broken leg will be eased because people are caring. So that's the idea. And so we learn about we learn about the mitzvah itself, that there is a mitzvah, and we learn the importance of it from right here, that God visited Abraham. And if God does it, then how much more so we should do it. So now on the next column, the top right column below the line on page 99, we continue. When the sages envision God visiting Abraham to lessen his discomfort, they may be implying that sometimes all we can give an afflicted person is the gift of our caring presence. And when we do that, we are following God's ways, right? So in other words, we shouldn't be afraid of visiting somebody who is sick, no matter how sick they are. That, sometimes when we visit people and people say they're not feeling well, we want to do something to help make them feel better, ease their discomfort in some way. And sometimes we know that it's impossible to ease someone's discomfort. But what the commentary is pointing out, and what other chaplains will point out, is that just this, I'll get to your question in a second, Arnie, that just the idea of visiting is enough. And that's all you have to do. It's the same with visiting a mourner. The same nichum avelim, comforting the mourner in a more serious way, an emotional way than visiting the sick. It's the same idea. No matter how tragic the death is, person who is sitting shiva, the more tragic, it might be more difficult for someone to visit, because what are you going to say? How are you going to make that person feel better? In Jewish tradition, when you visit the mourner, you're not supposed to say anything until the mourner speaks first. So just by going and being physically present in the shiva house is enough for the mourner to see that you're there, and that you shouldn't have to feel that you have to come up with the right words to say. In fact, you shouldn't say anything until the mourner says something. And no matter what the mourner says, then you can respond to that and have a conversation. So with visiting the mourner, with visiting the sick, it's all about being a physical presence. So is this the single place in the Torah where the commandment to visit the sick is contained? Arnie, that's a good question. And no, we have, well, in the Torah, maybe, but in the Bible, no. We do have, I think Isaiah visited King Hezekiah when Hezekiah was sick. And see, this is, my father asked me yesterday, is it okay if I attend a Torah class? You're not going to be worried that I'm here. So this is like a test of my Bible knowledge in front of my father here. So King Hezekiah was sick, and the prophet Isaiah visited him. Job was sick and also a mourner. So he was afflicted with boils, but also, his children were killed by God in this. Just read the book of Job to understand this theological challenging book, and people come to visit him. So we have that. Moses praised for his sister Miriam, El Na Rafana La. So did he visit her? you would imagine that, yes, he visited her and then prayed for her. So yeah, so there could be that uh, Isaac, so Jacob and Esau come to their father because his father's eyes are dimmed and he's getting up there in age. That's what the Torah tells us. Were they visiting the sick, or are they getting their last blessing? So, right, that could be visiting the sick. Same with Jacob and his children coming to him to get their final blessing. Were they visiting the sick? So it's not really presented as visiting the sick, but it could be there. But certainly this is the first time, and the fact that it's God doing the visiting gives the message to the rabbis. Bikur cholim, visiting the sick, it's a mitzvah, and it's so important because God did it that we have to do it too. Okay, so that's now. The commentary goes on. By turning away from God to attend to the three strangers, right? So now that's a question here. Verse 1 says, the Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. So is that one instance of a vision of God? And then verse 2, looking up, Abraham, saw three men standing near him. Now, is verse 2 an explanation of verse 1? In other words, what is Abraham seeing? Is Abraham seeing both God and three angels? Or is Abraham seeing God in the form of three angels? Right? So God appeared. So this is like perhaps the narrator is providing the context. God appeared to Abraham. Okay? Scene opens. Verse 2, Abraham sees three angels. Perhaps what I'm suggesting is the three men that Abraham sees are God in the form of angels, because it might be difficult and challenging to see God. Right? When the Israelites saw God at Mount Sinai, the description of that event was kind of upside down. They saw the thunder and heard the lightning as part of seeing God. So their senses were frazzled and discombobulated because of witnessing or experiencing God's presence. So perhaps God understood that human beings cannot, and when God passes God's presence by Moses, when Moses is on Mount Sinai, God tells him, stand behind the rock because you can't see my face and live. So perhaps God is transformed into the form of three angels. That's what I'm suggesting here, that it's not two separate things happening, but rather verse 2 is an explanation of verse 1, that's how Abraham is seeing God. And they're described as three men. So let's see what this means. By turning away from God to attend to the three strangers, Abraham teaches us that caring for others is a great mitzvah. Hospitality to wayfarers is greater than welcoming the divine presence, from the Talmud Shabbat 127a. So they appear as men. So this is hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests into your home is another. So two mitzvahs in the course of two sentences. Bikur cholim, God visiting Abraham. Hachnasat orchim, Abraham opening up and greeting the three angels. And according to the Talmud, Abraham is saying, excuse me, God, there are three people who just came. Can you imagine that the chutzpah then of Abraham to suggest that putting God on hold to receive the three angels? So that's why I'm perhaps it's an acceptable reading to suggest that the three angels are God, that they're not two separate things going on here. But for teaching purposes, the Talmud suggests that it's two different things, and that God allows God's self to be interrupted by these three men so that Abraham can teach the value of hachnasat orchim. Right. So Carl asks a good question then about Bikur Cholim and Nichum Avelim. We see that in the chat. Since we can't physically be with people for safety and health reasons, does a virtual visit count? So, that's a very good question, Carl, because it also relates to counting people in a minyan. Does a virtual minyan count as opposed to a physical presence? So, all things being equal, the rabbis say, what the rabbis would say, the best is to be physically present with somebody else. So the rabbis, of course, had no idea that there would be such a thing as a telephone, let alone Zoom. So does once the telephone is only 100 or so years old, and even back 100 years ago, so 100 years ago, 1920, like how many people had a telephone in their home, right? Maybe the corner grocer had a telephone, and then you could get a phone call from the corner grocer. Somebody would run and say, hey, you got a phone call, come down to the corner store to listen to the phone call. So, even 100 years ago, a phone call doesn't count as being physically present because not everybody had a phone. So, um, today, during the pandemic, what are you going to do to try to maintain a sense of community? So I have argued, and many other non-Orthodox rabbis argue, that Zoom is an adequate substitute. Now, there will be some non-Orthodox rabbis who will say that as soon as COVID restrictions allow, as soon as we can be present, then Zoom doesn't count anymore. Some rabbis will say that right away. The question will be what other rabbis will do once a vaccine is available and we can go back to being present with one another physically. Will we still be counting in a minyan on Zoom? Would we still rely on Zoom to visit the mourner or visit the sick? So I would say for visiting the sick and visiting the mourner, the only choice we have now, safety and health-wise, is doing it by Zoom. And the Zoom Shiva Minyanim that we've done, the Zoom Shloshim that we did last week for David Mendick, those have been powerful to do because, especially with David Mendick, who had family in England and family in Australia, who were on the call at the time. That's really bringing people from around the world to be present, but not physically present. And that provided a great sense of comfort. So I would argue that visiting the sick and comforting the mourner on Zoom still has the power and the effective way to get the job of the mitzvah done, making somebody feel better. And I would, but this is, the argument for rabbis today is, what is the original meaning of the rabbis when they interpreted and taught about visiting the sick and visiting the mourner? It's like the argument about Supreme Court justices, originalist. What were the founding fathers? What did they really mean when they wrote the Constitution versus whether jurists today have the right to interpret the Constitution, and jurists in every generation have the right to interpret and evolve the Constitution. So it's the same with the Mishnah and the Talmud. There are some who claim to be Torah true, who would say, no, any kind of innovation is bad. We don't want to do that. We want to get back to the original form of ritual and practice. And there are others, that's what conservative Judaism is about, who argue that no, just as the rabbis in the Talmud innovated and interpreted, so too we have the right and the authority to continue to innovate and to interpret. So just the fact of creating the mitzvot Bikur Cholim and Nichum Avelim, right? The Torah doesn't say in the Ten Commandments or any other place specifically, you must visit the sick. The Torah doesn't say that. That's the rabbis who are reading the story and reading the Torah who are deriving, oh, God is visiting Abraham when he's sick, must be a mitzvah that we should. So it's one of the 613 commandments to visit the sick. And Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests into your home, also another one of the 613. A teshuvah on this, yes, there is a teshuvah on Zoom, not about visiting the sick or doing a Shiva minyan, but there is a teshuvah which I discussed back in May from Rabbi Josh Hiller of the Law Committee, all about Zoom and live streaming on Shabbat and all of that. So, and it's accessible online. All you have to do is go to rabbinical.assembly.org, and you don't have to be a rabbi to go to that website. If you are a rabbi, you can log in and see the website differently, and you have access to different things than anybody else does. But anybody can access rabbinical.assembly.org, and one of the pull-down menus from the words on top will get you to the Law Committee, and then you just have to scroll through to see that teshuvah, which was published back in May, which has all all the intricacies. And of course, there's no one answer that Josh Heller derives, but he provides reasoning for those who say no to Zoom or live streaming at all, or yes to sometimes, or depending what it is. Okay. Now, just to finish here on this page, and so I wrote down 5 different places in this portion that I wanted to talk about today, and I should have known that we might get to a second one. So just want to finish this page. So after the parentheses, Babylonian Talmud Shabbat 127a, Aaron of Karlin, a Hasidic rabbi, taught that when we turn our attention from God to tend to the needs of the people, right? That's the idea, that God says to Abraham says to God, hold on a second, I see 3 people coming. I want to take care of them. When we turn our attention from God to tend to the needs of the people, we do God's will. Conversely, God is not pleased when we place such a great focus on God that we ignore needy human beings. So this is an interesting concept too, that God wants us to ignore God if the situation arises that we need to take care of people. And that is exactly what we're supposed to do. That is our religious mission, to be taking care of somebody else. And if people only care about God and not caring about other people, then that is corrupting the whole religious enterprise. So that's what this comment is suggesting. That's a powerful statement. So believing in God and developing a faith system is not about ignoring humanity. It's not about ignoring all of God's creation in order to focus on God. That is a corruption of what a religious system is. The religious system is using that belief in God, using that perception that Abraham sees God in front of him. And what does that seeing God in front of him allow him to do? To fulfill the mitzvah of bringing guests into his home. That's what the perception of God, faith in God, is supposed to do to you, transform you into a better, saintly kind of person. Okay. Now, okay. There's one other thing I wanted to point out, which is an important concept in rabbinic law, in rabbinic tradition, not law. So now, he sees the 3 angels, verse 2, and he bows down in front of them. And verse 3, Vayomar, and Abraham said, Adonai imna matzati chen be'enecha, my lords, if I have found favor in your eyes, al not ta'avor me'al avdecha, don't go by. Stop here. I want to take care of you. So Chevron. So, if we can't picture Chevron as it is today, that it's not an isolated community. There are other communities around, but back in the day, um, uh, villages were kind of interspersed in the wilderness. So Abraham is at Mamre outside of Hebron, which is on the edge of the wilderness. And so here are these three people coming from the wilderness or from the desert, the Judean desert. So yeah, it's like an oasis. Abraham's tent is like an oasis. He says, please don't pass me by. Yukachna ma'at mayim. Let a little water be brought. V'rachatzu raglechem, and you should wash your feet. V'hishanu tachat ha'etz, and recline or rest under the tree. Okay, now it's just by reading it straight, this is just normal way of greeting someone who's come from a long way. Relax a little bit, rest in the shade under the tree, and you'll wash up a little bit, wash your feet by because you're wearing sandals, walking through the desert, hot feet. You want to relax a little bit, cool off, wash, and then there's going to be food brought in verse 5. So it's all about this. But wait, what did the rabbis say about let a little water be brought? So if you look below the line on page 100, and this is what the rabbis do. They take a story, the details of the story, which make total sense in and of themselves about the natural course of events, and make it into a bigger kind of point that Abraham or that the Torah is teaching. Let a little water be brought. God promises Abraham, as you brought a little water to my emissaries, right? These three men are angels. I will give your descendants water in the desert. As you brought them bread to eat, that's verse 5, ve'ekhapat lechem, and I'll get a loaf of bread, v'sa'adu lipchem, and you'll eat to your heart's content. Achar ta'avo, then you'll continue on your way. Okay, so Abraham is bringing water and bringing bread to these angels, God's emissaries. So God says, as you brought a little water to my emissaries, I'll give your descendants water in the desert. As you brought them bread to eat, I will sustain your descendants with manna for 40 years. As you gave them shade under a tree, I will give the Israelites a cover of clouds to protect them from the desert sun. So this is typical. This is Genesis Rabbah, a collection of midrash, rabbinic interpretations, stories on the Torah. Yeah, just a second, Jan. I'll get to your comment that you wrote to me privately. Just 1 second. But this is typical of what the rabbis do. They want us to know that the story here is not just a story that happened at that time. The story is foreshadowing what will happen in the future. Why were the Israelites blessed with having water in the desert? Because Abraham gave water to the angels. Why were the Israelites blessed with manna every day for 40 years? Because Abraham gave bread to the angels. Why were the Israelites protected from the sun and given shade? Because Abraham provided them a tree, a place for them, the angels, to rest. So that there's a concept, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, the action of our ancestors, literally the patriarchs, and we can make it egalitarian. The action of the patriarchs and the matriarchs are a sign, a future sign for their descendants. So this is a typical method of interpretation that the rabbis do, so that every little detail of a story that we think is just naturally part of the story becomes part of the bigger story of the Torah, and that here, what happens here, we have to relate it to what happened in Exodus and Numbers. Right. So Jan just shared something privately here about a young rabbi who so focused on Torah study that he doesn't hear his own baby cry, and his father is teaching him, "No, you got to take care of your baby." Right. So that's a story that is among many stories that the rabbis would teach, whether it's the rabbis of the Talmud or Hasidic rabbis that would teach the importance of incorporating spirituality into everyday life. And that if you're only focused on the book, if you're only focused on prayer and shul, and that's all that you think religious life is about, then according to the rabbis, you're wrong. Because the prayer, the davening in shul or davening at home and studying the Torah is not the be all and end all. It's all about leading you to lead a religious and full religious lifestyle. If mitzvahs are carried on to future generations, are sins carried on as well? Carl? Yeah, that's a debate in the Torah and in the Bible. So some suggest that every generation, well, the Ten Commandments says that God will punish the descendants of those who sin to the third and fourth generation, so that children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren would suffer for the sins of a particular generation. But some prophets suggest no, each and every generation are responsible for their own sins, and that punishment only happens to the person or the community or that generation that sins itself. So it's a debate. It is an actual religious theological debate, assuming that what happens to us is a result of God punishing us or blessing us. Okay, so if one believes that in that traditional Jewish way, that God punishes us for our sins and rewards us for the good things that we do, then the punishment could either be just you get the punishment, or that punishment could also be, depending on the nature of the sin, carried forward to second, third, or even fourth generation after you. So it's an important question that is not resolved in the Bible, and it's not resolved by the rabbis either. There's some who say no, sin and reward and punishment is just for that generation, or reward and punishment goes down to the third and fourth generation too. Okay. There is the other thing I wanted to talk about, and we'll end with this one, is based on verse 2. These men that Abraham sees. Who are these men? I called them angels. It seems pretty clear from the story that they are angels because they're delivering a message from God first, that Abraham and Sarah are going to have a baby in a year's time. Okay, and then they go on to Sodom and Gomorrah and save Lot from there, to save Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So because they have missions, these religious missions, they're seen as angels. But the commentary explains a little bit how we're supposed to understand these angels. Okay, right. So that where it says verse 2 on page 99, the second paragraph there. So it's the last paragraph on the right-hand column. It will become clear in chapter 19, verse 1, that these travelers are angels in human guise. What is an angel? Specifically, it's an agent. The Hebrew for angel, malach, is related to the word for task, melacha, or melacha's work or labor. So malach, it's the same mem lamed aleph kaf, and melacha mem lamed aleph kaf hey. So it's the same root, just in a different form. So a malach is a person, being that does work. So an emissary. We can think of an angel as a physical manifestation of God's will and concern appearing on earth to perform a specific task. As the chapter later discloses, when the task is completed, the angel disappears. This is also seen in the story of Samson in Judges chapter 13. So in other words, we have three people appearing to Abraham here. Two of them go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. Right. So it says that then that's how the rabbis understand that an angel has a specific task, and once that specific task is completed, the angel returns to God's heavenly court. What the form of the angel takes, that's all for the rabbis to interpret and to elaborate. The Torah seems clear from here that Abraham perceives them as normal-looking people, not people with a halo on their head or wings out of their back, right? That's the typical depiction of an angel, right? That was based on Christian depictions of angels and medieval art and Hollywood. So for clear from the Torah, if they had wings on their back, then Abraham would not have seen them as people, because people don't look like that. So an angel can take any variety of forms, and here it seems as if they're taking human form. And according to the rabbis, an angel who appears on earth is doing so for the specific mission that God sent them to do. So that an angel then is God's emissary. And there's, if you want, you can just Google, the Encyclopedia Judaica, I think, is now available online. And there's a very lengthy article called Angelology in the Encyclopedia Judaica. It goes on for pages and pages about the concept of angel in Jewish tradition. So if you're interested in that, go for it. Look for that article on angelology in the Encyclopedia Judaica, or just Google Jewish angels, and you'll see lots and lots of information about that. So let's end with that for today. I just hope and pray that the country continues to be quiet as the votes are being counted, and that democracy will be allowed to continue apace without any interruptions or interventions by anybody, and so that we have a safe, just, and peaceful transition. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. And we have Minyan this evening at 7:30. Minyan tomorrow morning at 8:45. Like I said in the listserv message, all the other stuff coming.
Yasher Koach, Jonah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Have a good rest of the day. It's good to see everybody.
You too. Everyone have.
Thank you.